What's going on, everyone? This is Kevin here, and this is the Motorola Moto G Pure. And in this video, we're going to be going over my top 5 reasons for why you should consider buying this phone. Now, of course, this device isn't really anything too special if you compare it to all the different smartphones out there, especially considering that this phone is a very budget-focused device. You'll have no problem finding this phone for well under $200. So of course, if you're only spending that amount of money, you shouldn't expect to get all the various features that you typically get with a $1,000 smartphone, for example. But that being said though, even though this is a lower end phone, it actually does have quite a few interesting features that it does bring to the table that I do want to highlight here in this video. Now, one major downside if you do end up getting the Moto G Pure is that it doesn't support 5G connectivity. So the most you can do here with the device is 4G LTE. So if you are looking to get a smartphone that does take advantage of the latest and greatest cellular technology, then unfortunately, the Moto G Pure won't really be able to provide you with that. However, the good news though is that 4G LTE certainly will be around for at least 4 or 5 years, if not longer. I'm really not too familiar with the roadmap for how they're going to be phasing that out, but considering that they're just now phasing out 3G, I would imagine that we're going to have 4G for a long time moving forward. So if you're worried about buying a 4G LTE only device like this one and thinking that you might not be able to use it after a few years, more likely than not, the phone will work perfectly fine on whichever network you want to use it with. But just keep in mind that if you want 5G support, you're not getting it here with the Moto G Pure. But with that out of the way, I would say that my favorite thing about this device certainly has to be the display. Now I remember that it wasn't too long ago that if you bought a budget phone and you didn't want to spend too much money, you couldn't really get a phone with a large display. The idea back then at least was that the more you'd spend, the bigger the display you'd get on your smartphone. However, with the Moto G Pure, that simply isn't the case, as this device gives us a very large 6.5-inch display. Now having a large display is great for many reasons, but I would say the main appeal of having a phone with a big display is that the way that we use our phones nowadays compared to a decade ago, for example, is far different. Nowadays, people are using their mobile devices more for social media and watching video content than they really are for things like phone calls and text messages. Now, of course, you're going to want a smartphone that does give you the ability to do phone calls and text messages with no issues at all, but nowadays, people are looking for more than just that. So, of course, in that department, this phone is also very good, as call quality is great, and then, of course, the responsiveness related to texting is just as good as it could possibly be. But since the phone does have a very large 6.5-inch display, it makes it really good for watching videos, browsing web pages, and all those various things. Now, the display itself, in addition to being 6.5 inches, is an IPS LCD display. Now, unfortunately, it is only 720p, but it still does look decently crisp and clear, and colors are pretty good as well, which certainly does make up for the lower resolution. Now the PPI with this device is 270, so it certainly could be better, but at the same time, it's not terrible. And we are getting a 20:9 aspect ratio, so a more narrow but taller form factor. So you might have noticed that about 4 or 5 years ago, we used to not have aspect ratios quite like this. Phones back then were a little bit wider and not as tall. But if you think about it, with the way that you use your smartphone, browsing through social media feeds, for example, if a phone has a more narrow but taller display, then technically you'll be able to see more of your feed in one frame, and you won't have to do quite as much scrolling. So it really does make a lot of sense. And then also, having the phone have a more taller but narrower design does make the phone easier to hold in your hand. But at the same time, you do get a lot of screen real estate here. And then with this phone, we are getting an 80.6% screen to body ratio. So not the best out there, but at the same time, the bezels aren't too big either. You know, we do have the thicker bottom bezel and water drop notch, but for the most part, the phone makes a great use of its space. Another benefit too with this device is the battery. So with the phone, we are getting a 4,000 milliamp hour internal battery. So with such a large battery, you'll have no issues getting at least a full day of usage from the device. But another benefit of having a big battery is that battery degradation won't be nearly as obvious here. Now you've probably noticed that with iPhones especially, it's extremely noticeable that after just a few years, the battery just doesn't hold up quite as well. And that's because iPhones typically have much smaller batteries than Android devices. Now, iPhones tend to be more battery efficient, But as the battery does degrade over time, which will happen with any battery, it's especially more noticeable on those phones. So considering that the battery for the Moto G Pure is already kind of oversized and more than we need at 4,000 milliamp hours, as it does degrade over time, it won't be able to hold quite as much of a charge, but since we already have fantastic battery life right from the beginning, it won't be nearly as noticeable as the battery does end up degrading, which is pretty awesome. And while we're on the topic of comparing a budget Android phone to an iPhone, here's another feature that this device has that you can't find with really any of the new iPhones that are out right now, and that is a 3.5mm headphone jack. So this phone, of course, does have Bluetooth as well, so if you do want to pair up wireless earbuds, you'll have no issues doing that. But if you also have any wired headphones out there, you will still be able to plug those into this phone. So it's pretty amazing that the headphone jack is disappearing from as many devices as it is. And while there are a lot of lower end phones that still do have the 3.5mm headphone jack, it still is worth keeping in mind that you can't get a headphone jack with every device out there. So if you really want a phone with a headphone jack, then at least you will get that here with the Moto G Pure. Another great thing about this device is the build materials. So while the phone is made completely out of plastic besides the display, it still does feel of decent quality. So on the back of the phone, we actually have this nice blue finish here. It's a matte finish, but kind of has a wavy look to it as well. And what's especially nice about this is that it doesn't pick up any fingerprints, and it's also decently durable as well. So it's not nearly as premium as if it had a glass back, but at the same time, it's not a fingerprint magnet, which I certainly appreciate, as I've been using this phone quite a bit, and you can see that you still really can't notice too many fingerprints. Like a few show up here and there sometimes, like some smudges for example, but compared to a phone with a glossy back, you can't see any fingerprints here, which is really good. And then finally, another feature that I think is definitely underappreciated with this device is the fingerprint sensor on the back. Now, it really wasn't too long ago that if you wanted to get a very cheap, low-end Android phone, you usually wouldn't even get a fingerprint sensor with the device. But with the Moto G Pure, not only do we have the fingerprint sensor on the back of the phone, and not only is it nice and fast and responsive, but this phone also supports face unlock as well. You can see right here in this section in the settings, we have options for both fingerprints and face unlock. So again, it's really nice that we at least have the ability to choose one or the other, or even use both simultaneously. So while at first glance, the Moto G Pure might not seem like the most exciting Android phone out there, I wanted to make this video to really highlight my favorite features about it, as these are certainly things that you might want to consider if you do want to get this phone. Now, of course, if you want to spend a lot more and go for the very high-end Android phones that are out there, like the Galaxy S22 Ultra, for example, you're going to be getting a bunch more features compared to a phone like this one. But I think a lot of the tech enthusiasts out there forget that there's actually a lot of people that don't necessarily want a bunch of different features. They just want a smartphone that can kind of just do the core fundamentals that you'd want from a mobile device, and they're not really interested in spending a whole lot more for features that they most likely won't be using. So definitely something worth considering there. But I hope you enjoyed this video about the Motorola Moto G Pure. If you liked it, definitely give it a thumbs up. But this is Kevin here, and I will see you in the next one.